Where do we come from? What are we? And where are we going? McLuhan says, the personal and social consequences of any medium, that is, any extension of ourselves, result from the new scale that is introduced into our affairs by each extension of ourselves or by any new technology, and that translates into, well, a new extension of ourselves is some new medium. And the consequences, the things that you have to live with, that's the message that comes out of that new medium. And there are always consequences. Where we end up depends on the past, on the present, and on our hopes for the future all mixed together. But Marshall McLuhan declares that the medium is the message. You could think of a light bulb as an extension of ourselves. It's a medium that doesn't have much content, but it does enable us to see after sunset. And the big consequence of light bulbs becoming common technology in the world was that people had more time to read. There was a change in family life. People got second shift jobs and could do all sorts of things that you couldn't do before the invention of light bulbs. Society changed in consequence of the introduction of the medium called the light bulb. You could also say that radio broadcasting had consequences. Now that's a little bit more like a medium that you might know. For example, when people started getting radios in rural areas, the question was, how are you going to keep the children down on the farm after they've heard a broadcast from New York City live? Radio expanded horizons. And that was so true in rural North America. And then the other question is, how could the National Socialists of Germany create group hatred without a station spewing propaganda to audience who only tune to their frequency? Radio, in the way it works, absorbs attention. The listeners hear one side of every story. And because of the way it's linear, you have to keep listening and you absorb the information uncritically. Without radio, maybe Hitler would never have gained power. There are consequences to all innovations. So today I want to talk about the innovations of the Cambridge platform. And it is a snazzy looking little document. This is not the original one, because the original was written in 1649, but it talks about congregational polity. And I think you'll recognize many things that we take for granted in Unitarian Universalism when we get to it. Incidentally, I visited friends in Boston, and I said I was going to give a sermon on platform diving, and my friend's wife gave me Greg Louganis' biography, which is actually fascinating. It might actually have been, well, it would have been a little bit more colorful. But that's for some other people, okay? So let's back up. Let's back up all the way to the 1st century, the Common Era, when Paul was writing. Interestingly enough, that time the idea of church was being invented. Well, I wasn't there, actually, but this is sort of what's going on in my brain, and how historically accurate it is. That's for the professors to figure out. But in those days, there was a temple in Jerusalem, and if you read the Hebrew Bible, there's lots of things about going to the temple and the things that she did, the sacrifices she made, the rituals that she performed, and grain sacrifices, animal sacrifices, priests and assistants, and who was allowed to go in where in the temple and all those things. But also around that time, Torah scrolls were starting to become available. And people, usually men, gathered to hear the Torah read. And by then, people weren't speaking Hebrew anymore, at least not commonly. But they could understand the Hebrew in the Torah. And the tradition was that they read the Torah and then they discuss what it was that they read. Those are the sort of two models you get, that somehow you have to come out with a church. Now, many of the people So they promptly participated in these group discussion type things. But the early Christian community wanted more. They wanted to share stories about Jesus. They wanted to find meaning about what had happened in their lives. And they also wanted to take these Torah portions and figure out where, for example, the prophets had anticipated Jesus' coming. They wanted to say something new. They wanted to do some new form. So they invented this thing called church, though they still may have also gone to synagogue. So Paul's letter to the church at Corinth was an attempt to make sense of the role of congregation. He took models from nature, in his case the human body, and applied it to a society. Such members of the society were the eyes, the ears, some were the feet, but all were valued. Now let's avoid trying to figure out which body part each of us is. That's Paul's model, and I'm glad to leave Paul behind. And even though Marshall McLuhan had not been born at the time, we can assume that this new medium called church had an intrinsic message in it. And so it created consequences. And the consequences was the growth of Christianity. So fast forward a whole bunch of centuries. By now the body has gotten really big. The head of the body is very far from the feet. Religious texts are in a language that not only do folks not understand, they don't even necessarily get told what the words are. They're preached in Latin up at the top, up at the front, and you're in the back and you're watching the ceremony. So the nature of church had changed from a sort of discussion group to a ritual. Martin Luther and the invention of the printing press came along, and they changed that. The medium of the printed page and the Bible translated into a commonly spoken language changed what church was. Luther encouraged individuals to read the Bible. He maintained that everyone in the community was priestly and that everyone was spiritual. Now, these revolutionary new ideas didn't necessarily last. Soon, structures were put in place to control who could be a priest or a minister. And now we've gotten up to the Pilgrims. The Pilgrims were inspired by the early days of the Reformation. And they separated themselves from the Anglican Church in England to stay pure. Now, that was actually a very dangerous thing to do in those days because established churches didn't like people thinking differently and used to put them in prison. So they had a desire for isolation, which was in some cases, in some part, for safety. They traveled across the Atlantic Ocean in a boat called the Mayflower, and they adopted a compact or covenant before they landed in their new settlement. And the compact included an interesting bit. It established democratic law for the colony, including election of all officials, including ministers. 10 years later, another group, the Puritans, settled a few miles north in Boston. They were a different sort of group. They were much larger, thousands of them, and they considered themselves still to be part of the Anglican Church. Interestingly enough, whereas the Pilgrims thought of themselves as settling in the New World, the Puritans thought of themselves as colonizing the New World, and that had a lot of interesting consequences. Really unfortunate consequences, of course, for the Native Americans who were already living there. But the Puritans had in their minds that they were doing this because it was their duty. Their purifying of religion meant that there would be no bishop in Boston to appoint ministers. Instead, they adopted the same idea as the Pilgrims had. The ministers should come out of the congregation and be elected democratically. This revolutionary idea was sort of fashionable in discussion circles in England until the English Civil War, which happened soon after the Puritans established a colony. Puritan radicals chopped the king's head off, of course, generally carried reforms far too far, Conservatives returned in fact to power, and they came back to hierarchical understanding of church governance. Like the Anglican Church in England, where a bishop oversees churches, or the Scottish Presbyterian system, where churches elect a session to govern themselves, but then groups of churches elect a presbytery with power over the individual churches. And the medium is the message. Anyway, this is getting to be some history lesson. So the question you might have is, why is all this important? Well, I've been thinking a lot about the question, why are Unitarian Universalists consistently on the extreme liberal end of Protestantism, or some would say off the end of Protestantism? What is it that makes us liberal? And my answer is that religious liberalism is a consequence of our governance, as described in the Cambridge Platform. So you see, the Cambridge Platform is pretty important. It's a book of theology, but it's what has been called organizational theology, a theology of how, not what. And it tells each congregation that it is its own church, a whole church, to use Paul's terminology. It's its own body of Christ. I mean, there's a lot of body of Christ all over the place. But let's use the word organization. You can follow behind here. When the English conservatives returned to control the Anglican Church, they drafted something called the Westminster Platform to define church authority. In a much more hierarchical way. But the Massachusetts Bay Colony had no desire to have bishops over them, so they had a synod of elders from all the congregations in the settlements. And they adopted their own platform of governance called the Cambridge Platform, because it was written in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And it defines congregational authority, that's self-governing congregations used by member congregations of the UUA and the United Church of Christ. So anyway, here are a few of the platform features. Every rule on the platform, they were very careful to make sure that there was something in the Bible that showed biblical people acting that same way. Or if they didn't have anything, they found something in nature that behaved that way. We have to have a reason to believe this, and God must have shown it to us somehow, the Bible or nature. So, the reason for organizations is neighborly love, and that goes back to Jesus saying, love your neighbor. The task of each organization is edification and mutual learning of members. I had to look up edification, so don't worry, it's not mistake. For them, Jesus is the head of the church, and each church exists as a covenanted group. And this line comes in here. This form, then, being a mutual covenant, it follows, it's not faith in the heart, nor the profession of that faith, so it's not a creed, nor cohabitation, it's not just hanging out together, nor baptism. So, think about how we become members of this congregation. And we do that by agreeing to walk together. Our responsive reading was one of those covenants. The platform speaks of ruling elders, which is kind of cool. The equivalent of our board. Thank you. It speaks of deacons, which we might translate into committee chairs. And then it speaks of ministers and teachers. All these officers are subject to free election. And the organization has the power to, in case of manifest unworthiness or delinquency, depose them. Interestingly enough, it also talks about how this might be a really messy situation. So it says that a congregation may ask a neighboring congregation to help them in determining whether somebody is unworthy or delinquent. Which is interesting. The UUA's districts have a officer called a good offices officer who will go and visit when there are situations that seem troubling. But they don't have any power to decide anything. Everything has to be decided within the congregation. So 2 weeks ago, we had a ritual in our service, the water ceremony. How many of you were here for that? So that's one of our sort of annual ceremonies. There's also a flower communion that many congregations do in the spring. And most UU congregations these days have a ritual of lighting the chalice. But the Cambridge platform describes the oldest surviving ritual of Unitarianism. Ministers and other officers are ordained by what's called the imposing of hands. The imposition of hands is a really interesting thing, and one of the reasons that I ended up deciding to talk about this was that last weekend in New Hampshire, I was at an ordination. And at the appropriate place in the service, members of the congregation, clergy, the families, friends, were all called to come up and lay their hands on the shoulders of the minister being ordained. And they can do that either directly or indirectly by putting their hand on somebody else's shoulder. So there was sort of chains of people all terminating in the person who was being ordained. And so they were all in direct or indirect contact. And that act of putting hands on was what ordained my friend Kent to the office of minister. And he's now Reverend Kent Cusick. So, of course, the members of the congregation had to first have a vote and elect him to the office, but that didn't ordain him. You can understand the separation of those two things. And the platform talks about congregational self-governance, self-determination in admitting members, and excommunication. It says that when congregations get too big for their building, some members should remove themselves to another place of worship and form a new congregation. And actually, that's the way, that was the only way that Unitarianism grew in the 19th century, was the churches got too big. People went and started a new congregation, a second congregation of whatever town. And so it's this sort of budding process. Unitarians and Unitarian Universalists are not really big at founding congregations in the middle of nowhere. But thank goodness they're figuring out that the Cambridge platform isn't the last word, and they're just trying to. They also say that congregations ought to work together to help each other in times of need, and consult together in questions of doctrine. So there's a program in some districts, I'm not sure whether Joseph Priestley District has one called Chalice Lighters. Okay. And that's a really good thing. It's a way of focusing energy, focusing money on a project, whereas usually a smaller congregation needs to have something like a handicap ramp, and there's no way that they're going to raise enough money for it. So they go out to the other congregations and say, please help, people help. It gets done, and then those people know that they should be giving money to the next one of these chalice lighter calls. I'm sure we'll hear more about that in the future. There's also the idea of one congregation admonishing another. This is fascinating. It's like, whoa, what's going on there? Anyway, whenever there's a public offense, one congregation can admonish another. That it doesn't actually do anything. They have no control over the other one, but they could say it. They could say what you were preaching was not the true gospel. And then there are other rules that say things like, if you're a member of one congregation, you can actually go to church someplace else. You can go to another congregation, and they'll have to let you in the door. And that isn't true of all denominations. There's a certain welcoming that we just naturally have and just assumed. And the other one is that churches can write letters of recommendation to other churches. So when somebody moves someplace else, you can actually say, yeah, they were here, and they were good people. And then there's one more rule that says if you're a new group trying to start a new church, don't muscle in on the turf of an established church. So, reasonable word. You know, they actually went through all this stuff and came up with this in 1649. Then there's this thing about civil authorities, which I thought was kind of cool. First, they have civil authorities to tax the population to support the church. That makes sense, doesn't it? Great. You should tax the population. Anyway, this system actually persisted until the 1800s. Believe it or not, 1830, I think it was around the last year that it was done in Massachusetts. And for those towns that became Unitarian in Massachusetts, it was the established church supported by taxation. That was an interesting time. And if you think about the medium of the message, what did that do with the way people thought about church? And they had one more job for the civil authorities. In cases of idolatry, blasphemy, heresy, venting corrupt and pernicious opinions that destroy the foundation, open contempt for the word preached, profanation of the Lord's day, disturbing the peaceable administration and exercise of worship and holy things of God, and the like. Perpetrators are to be restrained and punished by civil authorities. Always good to have those civil authorities. So I suppose that, Massachusetts and New Jersey, for that matter, have blue laws up until fairly recently. And you can see that basis in this declaration. But once the things like blue laws and civil support of a church are cleared away, you see how this structure might allow new ideas to develop. Since governance only comes from those in your community, agreement on innovation is immediate. There's no provision that it has to be approved by a bishop or by a committee that's far away. Imagine for a moment that when I preach, I have to submit what I was planning to say to a committee, who could then tell me to change, no, not that. Delete that. Oh, when you really have to say this too. What would that do to my sermon? What would that do to the theme that you heard in church? If a bishop in Philadelphia could say no to this congregation's decision to become a welcoming congregation for lesbian, gay men, bisexual, transgender persons, would the congregation have even tried? And if we had control over other congregations, would we spend our time meddling in their affairs? Having power can be as pernicious as having other people have power over us. I'm convinced that the medium, that is the way that we've extended our individual abilities through forming this congregation, is the message of Unitarian Universalism. It's our organizational theology. And it echoes in many parts of the Unitarian Universalist Association's purposes and principles. We covenant to affirm and promote a free and responsible search for truth and meaning, the right of conscience and use of the democratic process within our congregations and in society at large. And we draw from many sources, including Jewish and Christian teachings, which call us to respond to God's love by loving our neighbors as ourselves. And the humanist teachings, which counsel us to heed the guidance of reason. The message is visible in a variety of consequences. Our congregations adapt to new understandings and new circumstances. For example, as congregations became aware of our denomination's exclusiveness, our classism, in forms of institutional racism, sexism, heterosexism, those congregations that figured it out, that saw the new light, had the ability to process it and then admonish others in the association. Now, change didn't happen immediately, but in many cases, congregations took the counsel offered and worked through their own understanding of what had to be done. They owned up to their defects and changed or are changing still. They learned to see their complicity in racism, classism, sexism, cultural exclusiveness, or heterosexism. Perhaps if there were a Unitarian Universalist Pope, she could have forced these changes quickly. But so much concentration of power is much more likely to be conservative rather than cosmetic. Perhaps another time I'll tell you about an era when there was an American Unitarian Pope. But I'm going to leave that for another week. For now it's harvest time. We've come to autumn. It's a time for homecomings and harvests, for longer evenings that are lit by electric light bulbs, more time for family and friends, and a time for preparation for winter, for checking in with your neighbors, testing your snowblower, and placing hand shovels and salt in a convenient location. I really hope that your participation in our congregation, in its governance and its programs, and in its celebrations is never a burden and is often a delight. We gather together voluntarily. May we always see love in each other's eyes. Amen. Our closing song is Chant for the Seasons, which is in the Gregorian hymnal, number 73.